Welcome, everyone. LanceScurvX here, the Scurv podcast. I talk about a myriad of topics and situations. I like to base my stuff on human nature, but human nature encompasses so much. And in speaking about the topic today, human nature and fear has a lot to do with it. The title of today's show is Could You Have HIV and Not Know It? Most of us who are listening to this, for the most part, it may not be 100%, but I know it's not 50%. It's got to be higher than that. Most of us are sexually active to some degree. And it bedazzles me how in 2026, at the time that I'm speaking now, that so many people are not even thinking about HIV today. Many people are so reckless, it's not even on their radar. Many people will say, well, they didn't look like they have HIV. Now, I have to say, back in the day, I'd say the early 80s, and really technically 1979, where this thing called Kaposi's sarcoma came out, which was really HIV. It was a gay disease. It was a Caucasian, homosexual, sometimes African American, but it was a gay white man's disease. Really, they didn't say it that way, whereas white men, they said homosexual. But the funny thing is, I remember in Manhattan walking around. Now, for those of you who don't know New York City or know Manhattan, the place called Greenwich Village was like the unwritten, how could I put it? The unwritten designated area where gays can move freely. It wasn't written on paper, that's just the way it was. But it also had wonderful restaurants, wonderful bookstores, parks, Washington Square Park, the arts, people playing instruments outside and you throw them a few dollars. That kind of laid back thing. But it was, I don't want to say the word infested like it's something bad, but it was like if you didn't realize it coming there, you're like, wait a second. A lot of homosexual men walking around here. Some might be holding hands. You might catch some kissing. You're going to get a shock if you're not used to that atmosphere back at that time. Times have changed and now things are out more. But back then, it wasn't necessarily in the shadows, but it wasn't in the light also. So knowing this, I would go down with young ladies, of course, because I did not want to be identified or approached. Say around 1982, 81, 18, 19 years old, they had sushi restaurants down there. That was so good. But I'd always bring a female friend. And in actuality, it was easy to connect with a woman down there who might have been down there with her girlfriends for a time out where they're not going to be as harassed by heterosexual testosterone, if you know what I mean. So they didn't know me from jump, so they might see me, we get no conversation, say, hey, let's hang out. And, I'm laid back. I'm not trying to come at you in an intimate way. We're going to have a good time. So there were times when I liked to go down there. So many of the faces that I would see of these men, I didn't know what was going on. I thought there were a lot of cancer patients in their final stages with the way that the faces of these men looked like they were barely alive. I don't know if you remember this show. I believe it was HBO. They had a show called Tales from the Crypt. And the introduction always had this skull-looking creature. And he used to laugh after he spoke about the episode. And he would go, and he had a few strands of hair, but it was a skull. And I remember the song, the theme song. Dun, 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 dun. Well, these guys' faces look like that. Not everybody, but it was like, to me, it's like 15 to 20% of the gay white men that were walking around down in the village in the early 80s looked sick like this. Skinny, bones. How could he stand up? And I didn't know what that was. I couldn't figure it out. And then we began to hear about this thing called AIDS and HIV. Yeah. But that didn't stop heterosexual men from their conundrums with heterosexual women, because that was a gay thing. You see what I mean? So it surely didn't stop me. And I look back at how it slowly changed from being a gay man's disease to something spilling over into the heterosexual population. So now we had a reason to be quite concerned. So there was a point where it didn't slow down my activity, because I still moved in ignorance. But thank God, all of those years, and I was a wild one, that I was protected. So many people feel in their assessment of this thing called AIDS, how it went from a gay man's disease to something coming over into the heterosexual world, where there are two ways that people spoke about it. They said, yeah, these guys who are shooting needles and sharing needles, shooting up heroin, junkies, heroin addicts. They're sharing needles with people who had HIV and they got it. Well, you remember the famous tennis player Arthur Ashe, who had a transfusion and he got it? And that's not the common way, because not everybody's getting transfusions. So that held up as far as the sharing of needles. But not everybody, or not every woman or man, is dating somebody who is a heroin addict, known or unknown. So then the next theory came out, especially for the Black community, because there were so many Black women getting it. So this is what went across the lips of many. They said, it's gotta be those bisexual men. Those bisexual buggers are laying up with men, and they're coming back and bringing it to their women, to their wives, who are innocent. And even more so, it's gotta be those bisexual men who claim they're straight, but they're messing with men in prison. And you know what? I've seen it with my own eyes, because I used to work in a prison, in a jail. And I used to see a lot of men who acted straight, let's just be real, giving blowjobs and having anal sex before you bust them and stop them. They were doing it. Were they gay before they went to be incarcerated? I don't know. Some may not have been, but look, if you are doing that, I don't care if you got 25 years. There's no appeal, but that's your own choice. That's a personal decision. But it was flooding the Black community more so at higher rates, and Black women were getting it. And it became, at one point, I can't tell you the timeline, because the more the years go by, you know, certain things get blurred. But it was where they were saying Black women were the ones who were getting it the most. Or there was a surge in Black women, heterosexual Black women. And there were so many things going along, the stigma, and it was just so confusing. And then now you began to see people who you knew get it, and get sick. And do you think they were going to tell you? No, they're not going to tell you. No. Hey, just found out the other day I'm HIV positive. Nobody told you that. I saw church dudes who would never miss a Sunday in church, or a Wednesday, or a Friday. They didn't have girlfriends, but they were so much into the Lord. This reminds me of a group, 4 or 5 of them. I'm not going to mention any names because I don't want to put anybody's business out there, but I was privy to learn that this one particular guy that I knew really well, he was the older brother of a close friend. I used to practically live over there, just visiting and hanging out and overnight, and he was sick. And he eventually died, and it came out. But I never thought that he was dipping and dabbing, but the guys around him that were going to the church, looking back, they were all so slightly effeminate, and they were doing each other. And then there was another one from that crew that passed away, and another one. And there were other people in the neighborhood that through whispers, it came out that they died of AIDS, full blown. So now this is real. Now we began to see young ladies get it and go. They're gone. So now that shocked a lot of us, like, whoa, we don't know what we're messing with when we're messing with something out here. And so now in 2026, there are people who are grown, who were born around that time, who don't really understand the horror. And it's a different time. We have social media. It's pushing out all of these erotic, sexual images that just keep you in a state of mind where it's just, oh, I gotta have that. Look at that. And you see a woman in the street, or the woman sees a man in the street, or a man sees another man, whatever. Everybody's on fire. And nobody's thinking about that. I remember the terror of it. Right before that, we discovered there's a thing called herpes. That was bad enough. You mean you get this and you can never get rid of it? This is something that stays with you forever? Well, in the STD sweepstakes back in the day when you got yourself checked up, it's like you're rolling the dice. You're getting the checkup and you're getting your blood work done. And here they come with the results. And it's like you're shaking dice. I'm shaking dice. Oh, I know I laid up with that girl and didn't use a condom. She didn't get pregnant, but the things I did to her, I swallowed up all her juices. We did this, we did that. And how about that other one, that one night stand? And I heard she was sick, but we had the one night stand 3 years ago. I hope she didn't have it then. Oh, blah, 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 blah. Doctor comes back. I got to tell you what you got. This is not me now. I'm just making this up to be a little entertaining. I'm going to tell you what you got. Chicka, chicka, chicka. The dice are rolled. You got herpes. And because AIDS was so bad and a death sentence, where many were terrified about herpes, relatively, they're like, whoo. And what do they say? All I got is herpes. I don't have AIDS. But a year or two before that, oh my God, I got herpes. Now, so many people are walking around with herpes, don't know it, or they have it and know it, and they know they're not going to die. It's mild in comparison. But the ignorance today has made AIDS mild in comparison because they have drugs now that, and I'll get into that a little later, it helps to make people more reckless now. And so the other STDs are still out here. And this is my thought on it. Don't you feel that getting STDs, getting these different things, aside from the spiritual aspect of a soul tie, but it's not weakening your body in the first place? Swapping spit and other crotch sores, bodily fluids with other people? And like I said, coming up, I wasn't a saint. But this now is a whole new mentality, and it's quite scary to me. how people don't pay certain things any mind anymore. Playing Russian roulette like it's commonplace, like it's normal. What will it be like years from now? How many more people will have to die? Ignorance is killing us more than HIV. Let me get into a few points that are on my mind and just make a few statements about this conversation we're still afraid to have about this HIV epidemic that never went away. Medicine is medicine. At its best, medicine is supposed to protect people, educate people, and give them the information they need to make informed decisions about their own health. Yet when it comes to sexual health, too many people still approach the subject through embarrassment, judgment, stereotypes, outdated ideas about who needs to be concerned. That's especially troubling when we're talking about HIV, because the people who believe they are automatically safe may be the very people who need to have the conversation the most. This isn't about frightening anybody or making people feel ashamed. It's about understanding the reality of HIV, understanding what prevention looks like today, and refusing to let ignorance make decisions for us, as so many people allow. I'm especially concerned about the way this conversation reaches Black communities, because the burden of HIV hasn't affected every community equally. The CDC has documented significant disparities involving HIV among Black Americans, and that reality deserves serious attention. But recognizing a disparity shouldn't become an excuse for shame or stereotypes. It should become a reason for better education, better access to prevention, better testing, and better conversations between patients and medical professionals. The goal should never be to make people afraid of one another. The goal should be to make people knowledgeable enough to protect themselves. The problem begins with an assumption that has been around for far too long. The belief that HIV belongs to somebody else. People still imagine that HIV has a certain appearance, a certain lifestyle, a certain income level, a certain neighborhood, or a certain sexual history attached to it. They picture somebody they believe lives differently from them, and then they use the imaginary picture to convince themselves they're safe. But HIV doesn't care whether somebody is wealthy or poor, married or single, religious or non-religious, young or older, professionally successful or struggling financially. A person's appearance and social position cannot tell you their HIV status. Appropriate testing and medical evaluation are what provide that information. That's why this conversation needs to move away from shame and toward responsibility. Testing shouldn't be embarrassing. Asking questions shouldn't be embarrassing. Talking with a healthcare provider about HIV shouldn't be embarrassing. Discussing prevention with a new partner shouldn't be embarrassing. What should concern us is allowing embarrassment to become so powerful that we refuse to protect ourselves. There's nothing shameful about wanting to remain healthy, and there's nothing shameful about learning what medical options are available. There's also a responsibility that falls on the medical profession. Patients can't ask about prevention options they've never been told exist. And they can't make informed decisions when providers make assumptions about their lives instead of asking appropriate questions. When medical care is influenced by stereotypes, Everybody loses. The patient loses an opportunity to receive information that could protect their health, and the provider loses an opportunity to educate someone who may genuinely need that information. Good medicine requires communication, curiosity, and a willingness to look beyond assumptions. One of the most dangerous misconceptions surrounding HIV is the belief that you can look at somebody and determine whether they have it. You can't. There's no particular hairstyle, clothing style, neighborhood, occupation, income level, religious title, age, or relationship status that can tell you whether somebody has HIV. There's no special appearance that comes with the diagnosis, and there's no social category that automatically protects somebody from it. The person sitting next to you may look perfectly healthy because they are perfectly healthy in many other ways, but appearance alone cannot tell you their HIV status. That same reality applies when you look at yourself. You can't determine your HIV status by looking in the mirror, and you can't determine it simply by thinking you feel healthy. You can be married and need testing. You can be divorced and need testing. You can be widowed and need testing. You can be newly single and entering the dating world again after decades away and still need to think about sexual health. Your age doesn't give you immunity, and neither does your relationship status. The responsible approach is to understand your own circumstances and discuss appropriate testing and prevention with a qualified health professional. This becomes especially important because life changes. Somebody who hasn't dated since the 1990s may suddenly find themselves navigating an entirely different sexual environment today. The medical technology has changed. Prevention has changed. Treatment has changed. And the way people meet one another has changed. You can't take assumptions from 30 years ago and carry them into 2026 and beyond as though nothing has happened. The world has moved forward, and our understanding of sexual health needs to move forward with it. That's why education matters. You don't have to be terrified of HIV to take it seriously. You don't have to assume everybody is dangerous. You simply have to understand that you're responsible for your health. And being responsible means making decisions based on information instead of assumptions. That's a much healthier mindset than living in fear or pretending that nothing could ever happen to you. There's a subject that makes people very uncomfortable, but discomfort doesn't make it less important. Marriage doesn't tell you somebody's HIV status. A wedding ring isn't a medical test. And a marriage certificate doesn't provide a laboratory result. Saying that you trust your husband or wife doesn't change that reality either. Trust may be an important part of a healthy relationship, but trust and medical verification are two different things. That doesn't mean people shouldn't trust their partners. Love is important. Commitment is important. Faithfulness is important. But none of those things changes the fact that every adult is ultimately responsible for their own health. You can love somebody deeply and still understand you need to make informed decisions about your body. You can believe somebody is faithful and still believe in appropriate testing. You can have a beautiful relationship and still have mature conversations about sexual health. People sometimes become offended when sexual health enters a conversation because they interpret questions about testing as accusations of infidelity. But that's not necessarily what the conversation means. A responsible conversation can simply mean, I care about my health, I care about yours, and I want both of us to understand where we stand. That shouldn't automatically be interpreted as an attack on a relationship. In a mature relationship, protecting one another should be more important than protecting somebody's ego. The truth is that none of us knows everything another person does when we're not around. That doesn't mean you have to live suspiciously or turn every relationship into an interrogation. It simply means you shouldn't confuse trust with certainty. Your partner's choices ultimately belong to your partner, while your health belongs to you. Understanding that distinction doesn't destroy relationships. If anything, it can encourage people to have more honest relationships. There's another problem that deserves attention, particularly within medicine: the tendency to make assumptions about patients based on appearance and perceived lifestyle. A provider may look at one patient and assume that she doesn't need an HIV test because she's married, older, professionally successful, religious, or considered respectable. Then another patient walks through that same door wearing clothing that the provider associates with a riskier lifestyle. And suddenly, the conversation becomes completely different. The kind of assumption can create gaps in care. A woman wearing conservative clothing deserves the same thoughtful medical attention as a woman wearing revealing clothing. A married woman deserves the same opportunity to discuss sexual health as a single woman. A woman with children deserves it. A woman without children deserves it. A professional deserves it. Someone working a minimum wage job deserves it. A man deserves it too. Medical care shouldn't be determined by whether a provider believes somebody looks like the kind of person who needs a particular conversation. That's why medical professionals need to ask questions rather than make assumptions. Sexual history can be an important part of understanding a patient's health, and a respectable conversation gives the patient an opportunity to explain what's actually happening in their life. The provider doesn't have to make a judgment about the patient's character. The provider needs to gather relevant medical information and use that information to provide appropriate care. Nobody should have to fit a stereotype before receiving quality medical attention. The woman who looks like she has everything together may need the same testing and education as the woman whose life appears more complicated. The man who sits in the front row at church may have the same health questions as the man who spends his weekends in nightclubs. The point isn't to accuse anybody. The point is to stop pretending that appearance gives us medical knowledge. It doesn't. This conversation becomes particularly important when we talk about Black women because racial health disparities are real, and Black Americans have experienced a disproportionate burden of HIV. That reality should never be used to shame Black women or make them feel as though there's something wrong with them. Instead, it should make us demand better education, better prevention, better testing, and better communication throughout the healthcare system. A Black woman shouldn't have to prove that she's respectable before her health concerns are taken seriously. She shouldn't have to convince a provider that she deserves an HIV test. She shouldn't have to feel embarrassed because she's asked about PrEP. She shouldn't have to sit quietly while somebody assumes that her marriage, career, church involvement, education, or social standing somehow makes her immune to sexual health problems. None of these things are medical tests, and none of them should be used as substitutes for an actual conversation about health. This is where the conversation needs to become empowering instead of frightening. We don't have to tell Black women to be afraid of everybody. We have to make sure Black women understand the options available to them so they can make informed decisions. We need women to know that asking questions about HIV doesn't make them promiscuous, distrustful, dirty, or paranoid. It makes them informed adults taking responsibility for their own health. There's a population that doesn't get nearly enough attention in conversations about sexual health. People who are returning to dating later in life. Life doesn't end because somebody reaches a certain age. A woman may spend decades raising children and suddenly find herself divorced, widowed, or simply ready to experience companionship again. She may have spent years focused on family and have little reason to think about sexual health. Then life changes, and she finds herself back in the dating world. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but there could be a problem when somebody returns to dating carrying the assumptions of another era. The dating world of today isn't the dating world of 30 years ago. Technology has transformed how people meet, social norms have changed, medical prevention has changed, HIV treatment has changed. Prevention options such as PrEP now give HIV-negative people another powerful tool for reducing their risk. Current medical guidance recognizes PrEP as a highly effective HIV prevention option. When taken as prescribed, it can reduce the risk of acquiring HIV through sex by about 99%. That's an extraordinary development in medicine. Yet there are still people who have never heard of PrEP or don't understand whether it might be appropriate for them. That shouldn't be a source of shame. It should be a reason to learn, ask questions, and have a conversation with a qualified medical professional. One of the biggest barriers to HIV prevention is the stigma surrounding the prevention itself. Some people hear the word PrEP and immediately assume something negative about the person taking it. They assume that the person must be promiscuous, reckless, or involved in a lifestyle they consider immoral. That kind of thinking can prevent people from learning about a medical tool that may be appropriate for them. Medicine is medicine. Nobody should look at somebody taking blood pressure medication and demand to know what kind of person they are. Nobody should look at somebody taking medication for diabetes and immediately construct a moral story about their life. Medication exists because human beings have health needs, and prevention exists because sometimes the smartest medical decision is to reduce a risk before a problem occurs. PrEP is a prevention tool. It's not a confession. It's not an accusation. It's an option that qualified health professionals can discuss with people who may benefit from it. The conversation should be based on medical information and individual circumstances rather than stereotypes. If somebody decides that PrEP is appropriate for them after discussing it with their provider, that decision shouldn't automatically become a judgment about their character. Another dangerous assumption is the idea that if you tested negative, your partner must also be negative. That's not how medical testing works. Your test tells you about your health status, while your partner's test provides information about theirs. Timing also matters because HIV tests have different detection windows, meaning a person who was recently exposed may not immediately receive a positive result depending on the test being used and when the exposure occurred. This is very important to understand. That's why medical professionals need to consider the timing and circumstances surrounding testing and help patients understand what their results actually mean. Testing shouldn't be reduced to simply looking at a piece of paper and saying, "I'm good." The question is whether you receive the appropriate test at the appropriate time and whether you understand what the result means. This is also why conversations before new sexual relationships can be valuable. Nobody has to accuse anybody of anything. Two adults can simply decide that they're going to approach their sexual health responsibly. Having that conversation doesn't mean you think somebody is dirty or dishonest. It means you understand that intimacy involves more than attraction. It also involves responsibility. I believe in love. I believe in commitment. I believe also in healthy relationships. But I also believe in verification. People verify their bank accounts, their insurance policies, their prescriptions, their flight information, and countless other things that affect their lives. Yet when it comes to something important as health, some people suddenly decide that asking questions is offensive. It doesn't make sense. You can trust somebody and still take responsibility for yourself. You can love somebody and still get tested. You can believe somebody is faithful and still understand that your health decisions belong to you. Nobody is saying that every relationship should become an investigation. The point is simply that responsible adults should be capable of having mature conversations about sexual health without immediately turning these conversations into accusations. Nobody is suggesting that you demand access to another person's private medical records or violate somebody's privacy. The point is that adults can talk openly about testing, prevention, and sexual health before becoming intimate. If somebody becomes furious simply because you want to have a responsible conversation about protecting your health, you don't have to argue with them or accuse them of anything. You can simply recognize that your health matters enough to have the conversation. Now let's turn the mirror toward the medical profession, because patients aren't the only ones who have responsibilities here. When somebody walks into a medical office, providers have an opportunity to educate that person. They shouldn't automatically assume that a patient doesn't need an HIV conversation because the patient looks respectable. They shouldn't assume that marriage eliminates risk. They shouldn't assume that age eliminates risk. They shouldn't assume that somebody who appears conservative has no reason to discuss sexual health. The provider's job isn't to guess. The provider's job is to ask appropriate questions, listen carefully to the answers, and understand the patient's circumstances and provide medically appropriate care. ACOG guidance supports HIV testing and prevention conversations without sexual and reproductive health care. And that means these conversations have a legitimate place in modern medical practice. Sometimes the conversation doesn't have to be complicated. A provider can ask about sexual history, discuss appropriate testing, explain prevention options, and give the patient an opportunity to ask questions. That conversation may only take a few minutes, but those few minutes can make an enormous difference. A patient may leave the office knowing about a prevention option they had never heard of before. That's part of what good medical care is supposed to accomplish. Patients also have to become stronger advocates for themselves. If you don't remember the last time you were tested, ask. If your provider has never discussed HIV prevention with you, ask whether it should be a part of your care. If you've entered a new relationship, have an honest conversation. If you're sexually active and wondering whether PrEP might be appropriate for you, talk with a qualified health professional. You're not being difficult by asking questions about your body. You're being responsible. You're not insulting your doctor by wanting to understand your health. You're participating in your own care. A good medical relationship should allow room for questions, explanations, and honest discussion. If your doctor dismisses a legitimate concern without giving you a reasonable explanation, you have every right to seek another medical opinion. Your health isn't supposed to be a popularity contest. You don't need to worry about whether you're making somebody uncomfortable when you're asking reasonable questions about your own well-being. Speak up, keep track of your health information, understand what tests you've received, and make sure you understand what the results mean. We also have to stop talking about HIV as though a diagnosis automatically means somebody's life is over. Modern HIV treatment has transformed what living with HIV can look like. People who receive appropriate treatment can live long, healthy lives, and people who maintain an undetectable viral load through effective treatment do not sexually transmit HIV. There's an enormous medical advancement that deserves to be understood. That doesn't mean HIV should be taken lightly. It means fear needs to be replaced with accurate information. Testing matters. Early diagnosis matters. Treatment matters. Prevention matters. And stigma helps nobody. Someone living with HIV isn't automatically dirty, irresponsible, dangerous, or immoral. Those labels don't protect anybody. In most cases, they simply make people more afraid to get tested or seek medical care. We should want people moving toward medical care rather than away from it. We should want people to understand that a diagnosis is something that requires treatment and support, not a reason for society to throw somebody away. When people understand that treatment works and that prevention exists, the conversation becomes much more productive. We talk about the HIV epidemic, but there's another problem sitting right beside it: the lack of knowledge. There are people who don't know what PrEP is. There are people who don't know when they were last tested. There are people who don't understand the difference between HIV and AIDS. There are people who believe HIV only affects certain kinds of people. There are people who think treatment is still what it was decades ago. And there are people who believe their relationship status somehow makes them medically exempt. That's the ignorance we need to confront. Not people, not communities, not patients. Ignorance. Ignorance simply means there's something you don't know yet. And the beautiful thing about ignorance is that it can be replaced with knowledge. You can learn, you can ask questions, you can get tested, you can learn about prevention, you can seek treatment, you can make different decisions tomorrow because you learned something today. We've turned self-care into an entire industry. We talk about skincare, hair care, exercise, nutrition, vacations, therapy, rest, massages, and countless other things that can help people feel better and live healthier lives. But sexual health is self-care too. Getting tested is self-care. Learning about HIV prevention is self-care. Having uncomfortable conversations is self-care. Knowing your status is self-care. Taking medication prescribed by a qualified professional is most definitely self-care. Walking away from somebody who refuses to respect your health can also be self-care. We have to stop treating sexual health conversations as something dirty that belongs in the shadows. These conversations belong alongside the rest of the things we do to protect ourselves. Talk about them with your adult children. Talk about them with your friends. Talk about them with your partner. Talk about them with your healthcare provider. Make the conversation normal enough that people don't feel ashamed for wanting to stay healthy. Medical science has made incredible progress in the fight against HIV, but scientific progress doesn't help somebody who doesn't know the options exist. A provider can't educate a patient about prevention if the conversation never happens. A patient can't ask for something they've never heard about. A community can't confront a health disparity while pretending the problem doesn't exist. We have to do better on both sides of the examination table. Providers need to ask better questions and listen to the answers. Patients need to ask questions and demand explanations. Communities need to stop treating sexual health as a forbidden subject. Families need to become comfortable discussing prevention and testing with their adult loved ones. Everybody needs to understand that prevention isn't an admission of guilt. It's an act of intelligence and responsibility. Shame is a terrible healthcare provider. Shame tells you not to ask questions because somebody might judge you. Shame tells you that respectable people don't need certain tests. Shame tells you that marriage makes you automatically safe. Shame tells you that HIV happens to those people, not you, but those people. Meanwhile, ignorance keeps growing and people remain unaware of the tools available to them. I would rather have an uncomfortable conversation today than wish tomorrow that I had asked the question. I would rather know my status than guess. I would rather understand prevention before I need it than discover it after an exposure. And I would rather make somebody temporarily uncomfortable with a serious health question than remain silent because I'm afraid of hurting somebody's feelings. That isn't paranoia. That's taking responsibility for your own life. Nobody else lives inside your body. Nobody else carries the consequences of your medical decisions exactly the way you do. Nobody else can take responsibility for your health the way you can. That means you have to become your own advocate, especially when it comes to areas of health that people have traditionally been uncomfortable discussing. Don't assume when you can ask. Don't guess when you can test. Don't allow embarrassment to silence you when you have a legitimate health concern. Don't allow somebody else's anger to prevent you from protecting yourself. And don't allow a medical professional to make assumptions about your life without giving you an opportunity to explain your actual circumstances. You deserve informed care, respectable care, and care that takes your concerns seriously. The hidden epidemic won't disappear because we refuse to talk about it. Silence doesn't make HIV disappear. Marriage doesn't make HIV disappear. Money doesn't make HIV disappear. Religion doesn't make HIV disappear. Age doesn't make HIV disappear. Respectability doesn't make HIV disappear. What silence does is prevent people from learning, and when people don't have information, they can't make informed decisions. That's why the answer isn't panic. The answer is knowledge. The answer is testing. The answer is prevention. The answer is treatment. The answer is responsible medical care. The answer is people taking ownership of their health instead of leaving everything to assumptions. This is bigger than one diagnosis or one medical appointment. It's about changing the way we think about health itself and recognizing that prevention should happen before a crisis whenever possible. So here's where I want to leave you. Don't wait for somebody else to care more about your health than you do. If you don't know when you were tested last, ask. If you don't understand HIV prevention, learn. If you're sexually active and wondering whether PrEP could be appropriate for you, talk to a qualified healthcare professional. You don't have to be ashamed of protecting yourself, and you don't have to apologize for wanting information about your own body. To the medical providers, understand the privilege that comes with sitting across from a patient. Sometimes the patient doesn't know what they don't know. Sometimes a simple question can open a door to an education that changes somebody's life. Sometimes a few minutes of conversation can give someone information they should have received years earlier. Don't underestimate the power of asking the right questions and creating an environment where patients feel safe enough to answer honestly. To Black communities, especially, we have to stop waiting until there's already a crisis before we start talking about health. HIV, sexually transmitted infections, testing, prevention, treatment, and healthy relationships should be normal subjects of conversation. We don't need shame. We need information. We don't need stereotypes. We need facts. We don't need silence. We need people willing to speak honestly enough to protect themselves and the people they love. And if somebody gets offended because you want to protect your health, let them deal with that emotion. You don't have to accuse anybody. You don't have to disrespect anybody. You don't have to assume the worst about anybody. But you also don't have to abandon yourself just to prove that you trust somebody else. Love somebody, but don't stop loving yourself in the process. Trust somebody, but understand that trust doesn't replace medical knowledge. That's the message I want to leave you with. Your health is too valuable to be governed by assumptions. HIV doesn't have a particular look, and prevention doesn't come with a moral label. Knowledge gives you choices. Testing gives you information. Prevention gives you power. Treatment gives people living with HIV a path toward healthier lives. And when it comes to your body, your future, your life, you deserve to have the information necessary to make informed decisions. I think I've proven my point here. There's a lot of things that we have to get over. The expected shame, the judgment. Who cares? It's your body. And you have to take care of it. Just inform yourself with knowledge. Look into PrEP if you're sexually active. Get tested. And whatever the status, move forward with taking care of yourself, because you have to love yourself. And oftentimes, we have to love ourselves more than defending somebody else's need to be trusted. Because trusting them or anybody else is not going to put you in a place to take control of your own life. Sure, you can trust, but the only person you really can trust is yourself. So do yourself right. Me personally, I've seen too many people that I know, too many personal friends, too many people who are not here right now who couldn't face the fact of how they were living and what they needed to know to prevent certain things. It's just that alone. You have your urges, you have your desires. I'm no different from anybody else, but we have to protect ourselves. If you hear the brakes on your car squeaking, you know it's time to change those brake pads. If you see smoke coming out of your exhaust, you know you should have changed your oil a long time ago. But we shouldn't have to wait to see some kind of sign before we go to take care of ourselves. This should be something regular. Do you wait to have cavities before you brush your teeth? Right? Do you... Look, I can go on and on with that. I think I proved the point. But please, you don't have to tell me anything. Just look about yourself, your health, and your health on so many different levels. There's so many things out here that we succumb to, we fall to, that could have been prevented, right? Much love to you all. I speak to you because I do love you. And I don't want to hear of another story of one of my brothers or sisters leaving up out of here with the talents and abilities that they have because they came from a religious family and they didn't want to talk about these things. They won't know. They didn't know what you were doing when you were doing it, right? So the doctor's not going to tell. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Let's live a long, happy life. God knows there's so much stress out here and so many things to be distracted by. We can't be the biggest people in our lives doing ourselves wrong, all right? Much love to you all. LanceScurv out. On to the next one. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. And let's think about all of the people that we love that are not here because they were ignorant to HIV situations and HIV facts. Peace.